I first noticed something was wrong when my daughter Chloe stopped playing outside. Normally, she was a bundle of energy, running through the yard until dusk, chasing butterflies or kicking a soccer ball around. Every evening I'd have to call her in multiple times for dinner before she would finally come inside, breathless and flushed, with a wide grin on her face. But lately, something had changed. Instead of playing in the yard, Chloe spent her afternoons indoors, sitting by the large window in the living room, her small body motionless as she stared out into the backyard. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids go through phases, right? I assumed maybe she was just tired, or maybe she was inventing some new, quiet game for herself. But after several days of this odd behavior, I began to worry. It was a cool autumn evening when I first noticed the shift from peculiar to terrifying. The sun was setting, casting long orange shadows across the yard. I was in the kitchen, finishing up dinner, when I called for Chloe. "Chloe, dinner's ready." No response. My stomach twisted as the strange silence filled the air. Normally, she'd be running to the table, eager to eat after a long day of play. I wiped my hands on a towel and went to find her. I found her standing by the window again, her small hand pressed flat against the glass, her face pale and expressionless as she gazed out into the yard. "Chloe?" I called softly, stepping closer. "Honey, what are you looking at?" She didn't respond right away. Her eyes remained fixed on something just beyond the tree line at the far end of our yard. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper, so soft that I had to strain to hear it. "The man by the tree, he's waving at me." A jolt of fear shot through me. I hurried to the window, scanning the yard for any sign of movement, any figure lurking near the trees. But the yard was empty, bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. The only movement was the gentle sway of the branches in the evening breeze. "There's no one there, sweetie," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "It's just your imagination." But Chloe didn't move. Her eyes remained locked on the tree, her face expressionless. "He's tall and pale," she said, her voice unnervingly matter-of-fact. "And he says I should come play with him." My heart skipped a beat. Cold dread settled in my chest, an icy grip tightening around my lungs. I forced a smile and gently pulled her away from the window, my hand trembling slightly as I brushed a stray lock of hair from her face. "Why don't we play inside, okay?" I suggested, trying to distract her from whatever strange thoughts were filling her mind. She nodded, but her gaze remained distant, as though she was still seeing something I couldn't. From that night on, Chloe's behavior became more unsettling. Every evening, without fail, I would find her at the window, her little fingers tracing patterns on the glass, her lips moving in hushed whispers. I would ask her what she was doing, but she would always give me the same answer. "I'm talking to the pale man." Each time she said it, a cold shiver ran down my spine. I wanted to believe it was just a figment of her imagination, a harmless childhood fantasy. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. There was something about the way she spoke, the way her eyes seemed to grow distant when she talked about him, that filled me with a growing sense of dread. Weeks passed, and things only got worse. Chloe started waking up in the middle of the night, her screams shattering the stillness of the house. She would cry out for me, her voice trembling with fear as she told me about the pale man, how he was angry because I wouldn't let her go outside to play with him. Her once vibrant, playful spirit had withered, replaced by a pale, hollow version of the little girl I once knew. She stopped eating, barely picking at her food, and her once rosy cheeks grew gaunt and sunken, as though something was draining the life from her. One night, I was jolted awake by the sound of tapping. At first, I thought it was just a branch against the window, but as I listened more closely, I realized the sound was coming from inside the house, from Chloe's room. Heart pounding, I threw off the covers and rushed down the hallway, the tapping growing louder with each step. When I reached Chloe's room, the door was slightly ajar, and cold air spilled into the hallway. I pushed the door open, my breath catching in my throat. The window was wide open, the curtains fluttering in the icy breeze, and Chloe was gone. I ran to the window, my heart racing. Panic gripped me as I scanned the yard, and then I saw her, standing at the edge of the backyard, her tiny silhouette bathed in the eerie glow of the full moon. She was barefoot, her thin nightgown billowing in the wind, and she was staring at the large oak tree at the far end of the yard. I didn't hesitate. I bolted outside, the cold air stinging my skin as I screamed her name. My feet pounded across the grass, my pulse racing in my ears. Chloe didn't move, didn't even flinch as I approached. She just stood there, frozen, her small body trembling. "Chloe," I cried, my voice thick with terror. "What are you doing? Come inside." She turned slowly to face me, her eyes wide and glassy with fear. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's here." My blood ran cold. I followed her gaze to the tree, but there was nothing there, just the twisted branches swaying in the wind. But the air around us felt wrong, thick, with a heavy, oppressive presence that made it hard to breathe. "Come here," I said, my voice shaking. I grabbed her, pulling her toward me, but as I did, she resisted, her small hands gripping the air as though someone was pulling her back. "Mommy, he's angry," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "He says you're keeping me from him. He says I have to go with him now." I felt a sharp pain in my chest, like ice piercing through my heart. I pulled her into my arms, holding her tightly as I ran back to the house, the cold wind howling behind us. As I slammed the door shut, I heard it. A faint, distant whisper carried on the wind. "She'll come back. They always do." My heart pounded in my chest as I locked the door, my hands trembling violently. I could still feel the weight of his presence, lingering just outside, watching, waiting. Chloe clung to me, her small body shaking with fear, but she didn't say another word. After that night, Chloe never mentioned the pale man again. But the damage had already been done. She stopped talking, stopped smiling, stopped playing altogether. She became a hollow shell of the vibrant, joyful child she once was. And every night, without fail, I would find her standing by the window, her hand pressed against the glass, staring out into the darkness, waiting for something, someone. The air in the house grew colder with each passing day. Shadows stretched longer, darker, twisting in the corners of the rooms like living things. At night, I would hear faint footsteps echoing down the hall, soft whispers seeping through the walls, and the unmistakable sound of tapping, always tapping, coming from Chloe's room. I tried everything, burning sage, placing salt at the windowsills, even calling a priest to bless the house. But nothing worked. The pale man wasn't going to leave. He had set his sights on Chloe, and no matter what I did, I couldn't stop him. One night, I woke to find Chloe missing from her bed again. Panic surged through me as I raced down the hallway to her room, but this time, the window was closed. Instead, I found her standing in the middle of the living room, her back to me, her head tilted slightly to one side as though she were listening to something I couldn't hear. "Chloe?" I called, my voice barely a whisper. She didn't move. Slowly, I approached her, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached her, I placed a hand on her shoulder, and she turned to face me. Her eyes were black, not dark brown, not shadowed, but completely black, void of any color, any light. Her mouth twisted into a slow, eerie smile as she stared up at me, her voice barely more than a whisper. "He's here, Mommy," she said, her voice cold and lifeless. "He's waiting for me." I stumbled back, my mind racing, terror clawing at my throat. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't move. Chloe took a step forward, her smile growing wider, and in the darkness behind her, I saw it, the tall, pale figure emerging from the shadows, its long, bony fingers reaching for her. And then, everything went black. When I woke, Chloe was gone. The house was empty, silent. There was no sign of her, no trace of the pale man, but I knew he had taken her. He'd claimed her, just like he had always intended. Now, every night, I sit by the window, staring out into the backyard, waiting. And sometimes, if I listen closely, I can hear the faint sound of laughter, Chloe's laughter, drifting through the trees. But it's not the joyful, innocent laugh I remember. It's cold, twisted, a sound that chills me to my very core. I know she's out there, with him, and I know one day she'll come back, because they always do.
It started innocently enough. I was standing at the sink, elbows deep in sudsy water, scrubbing away at the remains of dinner. The clinking of dishes echoed softly through the kitchen as the evening settled into a peaceful quiet. From down the hallway, I could hear the gentle hum of Emily, my 5-year-old daughter, chatting away in her room. She was always talking, whether to herself or to her stuffed animals, her boundless imagination creating entire worlds that I would catch glimpses of from time to time. But this time, something was different. The usual innocent chatter made me pause. I froze mid-wash, listening more intently. "Stop it, Tommy, that tickles," she giggled. The sound was muffled through the walls, but the name rang clear as a bell in my ears. "Tommy?" I frowned, the warmth of the soapy water suddenly feeling ice cold against my skin. Emily didn't know anyone named Tommy. Her friends from preschool had names like Lily and Max, and her baby brother, still too young to speak, definitely wasn't the source of that name. An uneasy chill prickled down my spine as I slowly dried my hands on the dish towel, forcing a smile, trying to brush off the strange feeling gnawing at my gut. Kids make up imaginary friends all the time, I told myself. It's normal. But something inside me wouldn't let it go. That name, Tommy, it echoed in my mind, looping around my thoughts like an itch I couldn't scratch. I tiptoed down the hall, my footsteps soft against the wooden floor, my breath barely a whisper. As I approached Emily's door, I could hear her voice clearer now. She was giggling softly again, the sound so sweet, yet carrying an undercurrent of something wrong. "Tommy, you're so silly," she squealed, followed by a hush. The type of hush that wasn't playful, the type that sucked the warmth out of the air, turning it cold as ice. My hand hovered over the door handle, hesitating for just a moment before I slowly pushed it open. The door creaked, a sound that seemed to drag through the silence like nails on a chalkboard. I peeked inside. Emily sat on the floor, cross-legged, facing the far corner of the room. Her favorite stuffed bear, Mr. Snuggles, sat beside her untouched, but she wasn't looking at the bear. No, her eyes were fixed on the shadows by the closet, her small face unnervingly serious. "Emily," I called softly, trying to keep my voice calm. "Who are you talking to?" She turned her head toward me, her movements slow, deliberate. Her blue eyes, usually so bright and full of life, seemed darker, almost hollow. An unsettling feeling crept over me, my skin prickling as she stared at me for a long moment. "I'm talking to Tommy, Mummy," she said, her voice eerily even, as though I had asked her the most ordinary question in the world. "He lives in the closet." My blood ran cold, every fibre of my being screamed that something was wrong, but I forced a smile, not wanting to alarm her. "Oh, what does Tommy look like?" I asked, hoping it was just her imagination at play. "He doesn't have a face," she answered, her tone disturbingly casual, "but he has sharp teeth and he comes out when it's dark." Sharp teeth? Faceless? My stomach lurched, the floor beneath me feeling unsteady as I fought to maintain my composure. I laughed nervously, brushing a strand of hair behind my ear. "That's a scary friend you have there, sweetie." Emily didn't smile. Instead, she glanced back toward the closet, her lips barely moving as she whispered, "Tommy doesn't like you, Mummy. He says you're in the way." I swallowed the rising panic and ushered her toward her bed, her little hand cold in mine. That night, as I tucked her in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something lurking in the dark corners of her room. Emily's gaze followed me as I turned to leave, her voice soft, barely above a whisper. "Good night, Mommy," she murmured. "Tommy says he'll visit you tonight." I stopped in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just whispered a shaky "good night" and hurried back to my room. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak of the house felt amplified. Every shadow seemed to stretch and move in ways it shouldn't. I lay there, wide-eyed, staring into the darkness, half expecting to see something, anything, materialize from the shadows. Just as my body began to surrender to exhaustion, a deafening crash jolted me awake. My heart leaped into my throat as I bolted upright. The sound had come from Emily's room. I ran, fear gripping me so tight it felt like my lungs were on fire. When I threw open the door, the sight before me made my blood run cold. Emily's closet door stood wide open, the hinges creaking as it swayed slightly. Her bed empty. Panic surged through me, my voice trembling as I called her name. No answer. I searched the house, my mind racing, terror gnawing at me with every passing second. Where could she be? I searched every room, every corner, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, in the living room, I saw her. She stood in the middle of the room, her small frame illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlights outside. But something was off, her posture, the vacant look in her eyes. Her arms hung limply at her sides, her head slightly tilted as if she was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Emily!" I whispered, my voice shaking. She turned slowly, her eyes glassy, distant. "He wanted me to come with him," she murmured, her voice barely audible. But I said no. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed to her, pulling her close, feeling the coldness of her skin against mine. I held her tightly, but my eyes couldn't help but dart toward the shadows that seemed to crawl across the walls. From that night on, everything changed. Tommy never left. He was always there, in the corner of my eye, in the whispers I heard when I passed Emily's room at night. Every night I heard her talking to him, her voice growing fainter, more distant, as though he was pulling her deeper into his world, further away from me. And the worst part? The shadows, they've started moving on their own. They stretch across the floor, creeping closer, like fingers reaching for me, ready to drag me into the darkness. I don't know how much longer I can keep him at bay. He's waiting, he's watching, and soon he'll come for me.
It wasn't unusual for my son, Ethan, to have imaginary friends. At 6 years old, his world was filled with boundless creativity, dragons soaring through the sky, fearless superheroes battling the forces of evil, and secret adventures that only he could truly understand. Every day, Ethan would come up with new characters to fill his vivid, colorful world, and I loved watching his imagination run wild. But lately, things had changed. His imaginary friend wasn't just a passing character in his make-believe stories. This one seemed permanent. This friend had become a constant presence in his life. Ethan spoke to it when he played with his toys, when he ate dinner, and sometimes, most disturbingly, when he was alone in his room at night. And that was when it started to bother me. I first noticed it one evening when we sat down for dinner. Ethan had a plate of his favorite chicken nuggets and fries in front of him, but he barely touched it. Instead, he was mumbling under his breath, as if carrying on a conversation with someone I couldn't see. "Who are you talking to, bud?" I asked, my tone light and playful as I moved around the kitchen, clearing some of the dishes. Ethan didn't look up from his plate. "Her name is Daisy," he said, his voice oddly calm for a 6-year-old. I froze for a second, my hand hovering over the sink. I hadn't heard him mention Daisy before, and there was something about the way he said it that made me uneasy. I quickly forced a smile, pushing the feeling aside. It was just another one of his imaginary friends after all. Kids have those all the time, right? "Oh, and where's Daisy from?" I asked, feigning interest as I continued to clean up. "She used to live here," Ethan said, still not looking up. He picked at his food, pushing a nugget around the plate. "Before us, before she died." I stopped cold. The dish slipped from my hand, clattering into the sink with a loud bang. I stared at him, my heart beginning to race. Ethan never talked about death. He was a joyful, bright kid, always focused on happy things, like cartoons and his action figures. Death wasn't part of his vocabulary, until now. I swallowed hard and slowly turned to face him. "Ethan, what do you mean she died?" My voice came out shakier than I intended. Ethan finally lifted his head, but he wasn't looking at me. His wide, innocent eyes were fixed on the empty chair beside him, as if someone was sitting there. His gaze was intense, and for the first time in his short life, his expression looked cold. "She doesn't like when you ask questions about her," he whispered, his voice barely audible. A chill crawled down my spine. I wanted to laugh it off, to tell myself it was just his imagination running wild. But something about the way he said it, something about the way he was staring at that chair, made it feel far too real. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house seemed to echo louder than usual. The soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, even the faint rustle of the trees outside sent shivers down my spine. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it was all in my head, that Ethan's words were just the harmless ramblings of a child. But deep down, I felt something stirring, something cold and unsettling. The next few days were filled with strange occurrences. It started small, doors creaking open on their own, lights flickering even when there was no storm, and objects moving from where I had left them. I would place my keys on the counter, only to find them on the table moments later. A picture frame on the wall would be slightly tilted, even though I knew it had been straight. These little things began to pile up, each one adding to the growing sense of unease that had taken root in my chest. Ethan's behavior grew stranger as well. He stopped sleeping through the night, often waking up with dark circles under his eyes, his once bright, cheerful demeanor becoming increasingly withdrawn. He no longer played with his toys the way he used to. Instead, he would sit in his room talking to Daisy. I would hear him muttering to her softly, his words indistinct, but there was always an unsettling tone to his voice. almost as if he was trying to soothe her, or perhaps appease her. One night, I heard Ethan's laughter echoing down the hallway. It was a soft, distant sound, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. I glanced at the clock, 2:47 a.m. What could he possibly be laughing about at this hour? Heart pounding, I rushed to his room, flinging the door open. The room was dark, the faint glow of his nightlight casting long shadows across the walls. But there, in the middle of the room, was Ethan. He was sitting on the floor, cross-legged, his back to me, his eyes locked on the corner. "Ethan," I called, my voice trembling. He didn't respond right away. He just sat there, staring. My eyes followed his gaze to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to pool unnaturally, thicker and darker than they should have been. My stomach twisted. "She's here," Ethan said softly, his voice distant. "She says you're not welcome anymore." My breath hitched in my throat, and I instinctively took a step back. I wanted to run, to grab Ethan, and get out of that room as fast as I could. But something held me there. Something cold and heavy, like a presence pressing down on my chest. I forced myself to move, scooping Ethan up into my arms. His body felt cold, much colder than it should have been. I held him tight, his small frame limp against me as I carried him out of the room. My hands were trembling, my heart racing as I hurried down the hall, my eyes darting back to that corner, half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I tried to go about our normal routine, making breakfast, taking Ethan to school, but everything felt wrong. The air in the house was thick with a tension I couldn't explain, like the walls themselves were closing in on us. I decided to call a priest to bless the house. I wasn't particularly religious, but I didn't know what else to do. The priest arrived that afternoon, a kind older man who listened patiently as I explained what had been happening. He walked through the house, sprinkling holy water in each room, reciting prayers under his breath. When he reached Ethan's room, he paused. His eyes lingered on the corner, the same corner Ethan had been staring at the night before. The priest's face paled, and his hand trembled slightly as he made the sign of the cross. He didn't say anything, but I could tell. He felt it too. That night, after the house had been blessed, I finally allowed myself to relax a little. Ethan slept in my bed, his small body curled up beside me. I thought the worst was over. I thought Daisy had finally left, but I was wrong. It was around 3 a.m. when I woke to the sound of Ethan's whispers. At first, I thought he was talking in his sleep, but then I realized he was wide awake. His lips barely moved, but the words were clear, too clear. "Don't worry, Daisy," he whispered, his voice soft and soothing. "Mommy can't make you leave." I froze, my blood turning to ice. Ethan's eyes were closed, but his body was rigid, as if something was holding him there, keeping him from moving. And then, slowly, his eyes opened, but they weren't his eyes anymore. They were dark, almost black, and they stared straight ahead, unblinking. I reached for him, but before I could touch him, a cold gust of air blew through the room, extinguishing the nightlight. The shadows stretched, thick and suffocating, swallowing the room in darkness. And then I heard it, a faint giggle, soft at first, but growing louder. It wasn't Ethan's laugh. It was a child's laugh, high-pitched and eerie, coming from the corner of the room. Daisy was here. I couldn't see her, but I felt her. The weight of her presence pressed down on me, cold and menacing. She was watching, waiting, and I knew she wasn't going to leave. Not this time, and neither was Ethan.